Today, we're going to make a procedural grid pattern. Let's go. We're in the middle of a series of tutorial videos on creating procedural shapes and pattern shaders in Unreal and Unity. So far, we've created a couple of signed distance field shapes and a couple of buttons. And as we've been going along, we've been creating a library of subgraphs nodes or material functions that can be used to create all kinds of other effects. I'll link the playlist for the whole series down in the description so that you can catch up if you need to. So today we're going to create this procedural grid pattern, the square tiles node. It can be used to create all kinds of grids. So first, it has an output called fill that just creates a tile pattern like this. And then it also has an output called stroke that creates the outlines of the tiles like this. And for each of those, for the fill and the stroke, it also has a signed distance field for the fill and a signed distance field for the stroke. And it has a couple of other controls too, like for example, you can control the number of tiles that it's creating, and you can control how blurry those tiles are. So if I give it a blur value of 0.5, for example, now you can see those edges, instead of being sharp and crisp, are blurry. So this is a really flexible node. It's very versatile, and I'm excited to show you how to make it. We'll start out in Unity today, and then I'll switch over to Unreal in a minute. All right, in order to make this square tiles node, the first thing that we need to do is create a node to generate the UV coordinates. And so we're going to come down here to the library of helper nodes that we've been creating of subgraphs, and we're going to come into the UV folder, and I'm going to right click and pick Create Shader Graph Subgraph, and we're going to call this Grid Tiles. And I'll open up our Grid Tiles subgraph, and we can get started. The first thing that we need to do is give ourselves a couple of parameters. So I'm going to create a vector2 UV parameter, a float parameter called tile U, and another float parameter called tile V. And then finally, my last parameter is a vector2, and I'm going to call this one width height. And let's give those some defaults. So I'm going to open up the graph inspector. And for tile U and tile V, I'm going to give them both a default value of 2. And for the width and height, this is the control that's going to control the aspect ratio. And I'm just going to give those a default value of 100. And for our UV, I'm going to select that one and click this Use Custom Binding box. And then we're going to type UV0 here. And we're going to use that as our input. And by default, well, let's go ahead and do it. We'll drag in our UV input. And by default, we want it to use our UV0 UV coordinates. And so I'm going to add a branch on input connection node and connect up our UV input to it. And if the UV input is not connected, we're just going to go ahead and use our UV coordinate node here set to UV0. All right, let's go ahead and set up our outputs. Our first output is going to be a vector2, and we're going to call it pattern UV. Our second output is also going to be a vector2. Obviously, these are all vector2s because we're outputting UV coordinates from our node. The second one is going to be called scaled pattern UV. And then the third one is going to be called raw UV. And we need to make sure that we set it to be a vector2 as well. All right, so let's bring in our tile U and tile V. And we're going to use these parameters to control the tiling of our UV coordinates. And so in order to do that, I'm going to make a vector 2 out of these. Just combine tile U and tile V. And then we just simply multiply our UV coordinates by our tile values. And that's going to give us the UVs that we need. So this that we've created so far is our raw UV. So we can go ahead and hook that up. And then for our pattern UV, all we have to do is add a fraction node here. And that's going to make our UV coordinates loop. Basically, we go from 0 to 1 and then 0 to 1 again. Whereas when we do this multiply here, we're actually going from 0 to 2. So if we want UVs that go 0 to 1, 0 to 1 in a repeating pattern, we're going to use the pattern UV output. And if we just want UVs that continuously go up, they can go way above 1, we can use the raw UV output. All right, the last thing that we need to do, and this is a little bit more complicated, we need to create our scale pattern UV output. And in order to do that, we need to know the aspect ratio of the object that we're applying the pattern to, so that it can conform, or so that it can stay a square grid regardless of the aspect ratio of the model that it's assigned to. And so in order to do that, I'm going to take my tile U and tile V and divide them by each other. So I'll divide tile U by tile V. And I'm also going to divide tile V by tile U. And then I'm going to make the results of this into a vector 2. And saturate the results so that we don't ever go above 1 or below 0. And now, like I said, we want to adapt our grid output so that it stays square regardless of the aspect ratio that we're applied to. And so in order to do that, I'm going to add this node here called aspect ratio that we created in a previous video. And I'll set the link to where we created that down below and also up here in the corner so that you can jump and create this aspect ratio node if you haven't done that yet. All right, and our aspect ratio node needs a width height input, and that's why I created this width height input in our blackboard here. So we're just going to connect that up. And now we're going to divide this value here by the ratio value coming out of our aspect ratio node. And now we can take the UV coordinates that we have coming out of our fraction node here, and we're going to add the scale node here. This is our UV scale node. And we also created this one in a previous video. So I'll just add that in. And then I'm going to connect up the result of this divide to our scale. And so what this is going to do is, regardless of our aspect ratio, our grid is going to adapt to the aspect ratio of the thing that it's applied to. And just so that you can see what's happening, take a look at our UV coordinates here. And actually, maybe it'd be better to add a circle SDF so that you could see the output. So if I take these UV coordinates and hook them up, you can see that we're generating multiple circles now. And we can control that based using our tile U and tile V. But if we set our width and height to something other than 100 and 100, like say we set it to 10 and 100, now you can see those 4 circles have been compressed. And basically what we're saying is we are assigning this to something that is only 10 wide, but 100 tall. So that's the aspect ratio. And so it's compensated by scaling down our circles. So that's how that feature works. All right, and so we can just take the result of our scale node here and plug it into our scaled UV pattern for our third and final output. And this is our grid tiles subgraph node. And this is useful. You can use this to make patterns tile, just like I did with those circles just now. And we're going to use it in our square tiles or our procedural grid pattern to generate the UV coordinates. So last couple of things that we do with all of our subgraph nodes, we're going to set our preview instead of 3D to 2D. And over here in our path, we're going to set this to procedural/UV. And what that does is it makes it so that I can access that in the create node menu here under the procedural UV category. All right, so we've got our subgraph there. Let's go ahead and make our square tiles subgraph. We'll go in here to patterns. And again, I'll right click and pick create shader graph subgraph. And we'll call this subgraph square tiles. And we'll open that up. And now we can make our square tiles subgraph. We just created our grid tiles subgraph, and we can find that under procedural UV grid tiles. We know we're going to need that. And we're also going to need a rectangle SDF. So let's go ahead and add our procedural SDF's rectangle node. And we're just about halfway there. Now we need to connect everything up and add some inputs and outputs. So for our inputs, let's add a vector 2, and this is our UV. We'll add another vector 2, and this is our tiles. We'll add a third vector 2, and this is our size. Then we're going to add a float, and this is our thickness. And finally, we'll add another float, and this is our blur. And let's go ahead and set up some default values for these. For our UV input, we're going to set it to use custom binding and UV 0. For our tiles, we're going to set these to 4. For our size, we're going to set this to 0.96. And I'll show you what this is in a minute. Basically, we're going to create multiple rectangles based on our grid tiles UVs. And this value here is going to control the size of the rectangle. You can see right now the size is set to 0.5, but I can control how big or small this rectangle shape is. I'm going to use this size to control that. All right, and then for our thickness, we're going to set this to 0.1, and that thickness is going to control the stroke or the outline of our shape. And then finally, blur, we're just going to default that to 0, and then the user can turn more blur on if they need it. All right, let's go ahead and bring in our inputs and connect them up. So we'll bring in our UVs, and just like we always do, we're going to create a branch on input connection node and connect our UV node to both the input and connected. And then we'll add a UV node and connect that to the not connected port. And we're going to connect up this little unit here to the UVs coming into our grid tiles node. All right, then we're going to bring in our tiles parameter, and we need to split out the X and the Y of our tiles parameter and connect that to tile U and tile V. All right, so that's how we're going to control the grid tiles. And now we just need to hook things up to our rectangle SDF node. The first thing that I'm going to do is take my pattern UV's output on my grid tiles and plug that into the UV on my rectangle. And you can see I've already generated now my procedural grid pattern. Very cool. Well, let's go ahead and add the other controls that we need here. We need our size, and so we'll bring that in from our blackboard, and connect that up to the size input in our rectangle. Now you can see I'm able to use this size to control the thickness of these edges in between our tiles. So if I take our size here and set it to like 0.5 like it was before, now we've got much larger gaps in between our tiles. But we had this defaulted to 0.96, so we've got big tiles and small gaps. Just by default, but obviously you can set that to whatever you want. Now we're going to take our blur value and connect it up to our edge max. And that's going to allow the user to control the blurriness of these edges. If we take this blur and give it a value of like 0.5, well, you can't really see it well here because our size is large, but if we set the size to 0.5 as well, now you can see we've got tiles with blurry edges. That's pretty cool. We'll just set it back to 0 for now. And then for thickness, we're going to bring that value in and connect it up to our stroke thickness input. And that's going to control these outline or stroke values. All right, so we're almost done. We just need to create the outputs now. And I'm going to go ahead and open up our graph inspector and add these outputs. The first one that we need is a float, and it's fill. We're just going to output all 4 of these values here. And so I just need to duplicate them. And I just need to wire these through. And then I have one more output here. And this is going to be our UV coordinates. And that just comes from our grid tiles pattern UV. So I'm going to connect that up. Oh, I need to make sure that this UV output is a vector 2. All right, that's it. We're done with our procedural pattern subgraph. And now we're able to generate all kinds of procedural patterns and control them using the parameters that we added. So really quickly, let's just bring this node into a scene or into a shader and see what kinds of things we can do with it. Oh, but before we do that, again, we're going to take our path here and type procedural/patterns. And we're also going to come to the graph inspector and set our preview to 2D. So we'll save that. And I'll just open up our temporary shader here that we've been using to try things out and see what we can do with our procedural grid. So I'll bring in our procedural patterns square tiles node. And let's take a look at what kinds of effects we can get with this. I really like the kinds of things we are getting with blur. And so I'm going to set blur to 0.5 and maybe our tile size to 0.5. That was a neat effect. We can also control the number of tiles that we're getting. We want a 7x7 grid. And we can also use the UV coordinates coming out of here to tile other things. So if we come in here to our procedural SDFs and add a circle, now you can see I can make a grid of polka dots using the UV coordinates coming out of my square tiles. So if I wanted to have these tiles and then maybe put holes in them, actually maybe I want to use subtract. Yeah, so now I've got a bunch of tiles with circular holes in them, and obviously I can control the sharpness of the edges there using my max edge here. So I'm able to use this square tiles node to generate grids of all kinds and do all kinds of effects with that. This is great. We're going to use this node next week to create a really interesting pattern. So I hope you can come back for that one. In the meantime, we've completed our square tiles node here. Let's switch over to Unreal and I'll show you how to make it in that engine as well. All right, here we are in Unreal. And just like we did in Unity, we're going to create the square tiles material function. And in order to do that, the first thing that we need to do is create the grid tiles material function. And so I've got my content drawer open here. I've come down here to our procedural folder, into the UVs folder. And I'm going to right click and pick material function. And I'm going to call this grid tiles. And we'll open up our grid tiles material function here. So we're ready to start creating. The first thing that I need to do is to create an input. And we're going to call this one UV. And I'm going to check the use preview value as default. And we'll make the default of our UV input into our texture coordinates. So I'll just wire those in. Now I need to make a couple of other inputs. We'll call this one tile U. And then I'll set it to use preview value as default. And we're going to set tile U to 4. And then we're going to clone this. And this one's going to be tile V. And it's also going to have a default value of 4. And so now I need to combine these together. And that's pretty easy. All I need to do is make an append vector node and append the V and the U together. And so now we have a vector2 value. Oh, I need to set the data types here. These are both going to be scalar. All right, so now I've got my U scale and my V scale, or tiles. Actually, let's make these consistent. I've got tile U with a space and tile V without a space. Let's go with the space. Okay, so I need to take these values and multiply them with my UV coordinates. And this is what's going to scale the UV coordinates. And then to finish this off, I can add a frac node. And this is going to take my UV coordinates and... Oh, actually, I need to set this input to... It's a vector 3 right now. I want it to be a vector 2. And now you can see I've got my nice UV grid repeating over and over 0, 1, 0 to 1, 0 to 1. And that's exactly what I want. So now we need to set up some outputs. This first output is going to be called pattern UV, which is what we have here. So I can just connect that up. Then I want to make another output, and we can just call this one raw UV. And the raw UV is going to be the UV coordinates without the fraction. And you can see instead of going 0 to 1, 0 to 1, 0 to 1, this one's actually going 0 to 3. And you can see those values getting higher as they go to the right. Okay, and there is one other output that we want to create. But before we do that, let's go ahead and clean some things up here just a little bit. I'm going to set my sort priorities. So for my input UV, 0. For tile U, the sort priority is 1. And for tile V, the sort priority is 2. And then I need one more input. And we're going to call this one width height. I'm going to set it to a vector 2. And this is where I can input the width and height of the object that I'm assigning the grid to. And this part of it is going to make sure that the grid that I'm generating here stays square regardless of the aspect ratio of the object that I'm assigning it to. And so just for now, I'm going to set the defaults to 100 and 100 on my width and height input, and set the sort priority to 3, so it's at the bottom of the material function. And now we need to connect up the aspect ratio, that node that we created previously. So I'm going to open up my content drawer, come here to helpers, and here's my aspect ratio node that we created previously. So I'll drag that in and connect up my width and height, and now that's ready to use. All right, so to create this third effect, actually we're gonna set the sort priority of pattern UV to 0 and the sort priority of the raw UV to 2. And we're going to create one kind of in between here with a sort priority of 1. And this one's going to be scaled pattern UV. All right, in order to create that scaling, I'm going to take my tile U and tile V and divide them by each other. I'll divide tile U by tile V, and then I'll divide tile V by tile U. And then we're going to append these two values together using an append vector and saturate the result. And then I'm going to divide this result by our aspect ratio node down here. And now that I've got this value that determines kind of the compensation that we need to apply for our aspect ratio, I can apply scale to my fractional UV coordinates. I'm just going to move these over just a little bit. And now I can add that scale node that we've created previously. So I'll come here to my UV folder, bring in my scale UV node, and we're going to plug this value into scale because we've been calculating how our UV coordinates needed to scale based on the aspect ratio. So now I can plug my UV coordinates into UV and then plug them here into the output scaled pattern UV. So now depending on what value I plug in here to my width and height, I can give different aspect ratios to my UV coordinates. So for example, if I give my UVs here a value of 50 and 100, now you're going to see that my UVs adapt accordingly based on the aspect ratio that is coming in. So that's a pretty cool feature. But anyway, so this material function is generating a tiled grid of UVs that I can then use for all kinds of other things. So let's go ahead and save this, and I'll show you how we're going to use this grid tiles node to generate our procedural grid pattern. So we're going to come down here to our content drawer again and come up to our patterns folder. And I'm going to right click in here and pick material function. And we're going to call this one square tiles. This is going to be our procedural grid pattern. I'm going to open it up, and I know that we need our rectangle sign distance field. So I'll grab that node. And I also know that we need that grid tiles node that we just created. So I'll bring that node in. And now we're almost done. We just need to create some inputs and connect some things up, and we'll have our procedural grid pattern. So let's set our preview up over here so that we can watch what's happening as I put it together. Let's go ahead and plug our fill into the output for now. And you can see that we've got a nice square going on over here. And let's connect our pattern UV output here to our rectangle UV. And now you can see I've got the beginnings of our procedural grid. We need to put a little bit more work into it. Let's create our inputs. So the first input that we need is our UVs. I'm going to call this UV and set it to vector 2 and a sort priority of 0, and we'll turn on use preview as default. And we also want to make sure that we give it a good default. So we're going to bring in our texture coordinates and connect them up so that if this input is not connected, it just goes ahead and uses the default UV coordinates. Then we're going to pass those UVs into the UV of our grid tiles node. Next, we need an input called tiles. And so I can just clone my UVs and rename that to tiles, set that to a sort priority of 1. Next, we need an input called size and give that a sort priority of 2. For tiles, we're going to give it the default values of 4 and 4. And then for size, we're going to give it default values of 0.96 and 0.96. The size parameter here is what we're going to use for the size of the rectangles that we're generating over here. And then we need another parameter called thickness. And we're going to give it a default value of 0.01, and thickness is just a scalar. And we'll set its sort priority to 3. And then finally, one more parameter called blur. And this one we're going to give a default value of 0. That's also a scalar, and its sort priority is 4. All right, so we've got all our inputs. Let's go ahead and connect things up. So for our tiles value, we can use a component mask here to split out the red and plug that into tile U. And then a second component mask to split out the green and plug that into tile V. So we've got our tiles hooked up there. And now let's go ahead and hook up our size parameter. We can connect that to the size of our rectangles. And now did you see what happened over here? We've got our edges nice and thin now because our size defaults to a value of 0.96. So all of our rectangles have grown to fill that empty space. And so this size value, the higher we make it, the thinner these gaps in between our rectangles become. And then we can connect up our thickness value to our stroke thickness input here. And that's going to control the output of stroke over here. Let's take a look at what that looks like. If I just temporarily add a saturate node here, you can see that we've got these outlines or strokes of our squares, and the thickness of those is controlled by this thickness input. And they're really thin right now. We can increase this to something like 0.2, and now we've got really thick strokes. But I think a default value of 0.01 is a little bit better. So let's leave it at that. And the last parameter that we need to connect up is our blur input. So I can connect that to our edge max input on our rectangle SDF. And you can see that kind of causes some issues here. We don't have a shader that's compiling correctly. I need to actually set my input blur by default to 0.01. And that's going to give us sharp edges. But then as I increase this value, my edges are going to get blurrier. Just for now, so that we can see what's going on, I'm going to set my size of my rectangles to 0.5. And then I'm going to set my blur to like 0.2. And now what you can see is that these rectangles have soft edges. So this blur is going to control the sharpness or the softness of the edges of my output. All right, we're almost done. We've got a pretty cool looking grid here. I'm just going to set my values back to their proper defaults. And the last thing that we need to do is just create or set up the output ports for our material function here. So right now this one's called result, and I want it to be called fill. Basically, we're just going to be duplicating these outputs here. So we've got one called fill, we've got one called stroke, and then we're going to create the SDF outputs as well. This one is SDF. And then this one is stroke SDF. And now I can just connect them up. So we're going to connect up stroke to output stroke. We're going to connect up SDF to output SDF. And we're going to connect SDF stroke to output SDF stroke. And we just need one more, actually. We need one for our UV coordinates. And our UV coordinates are coming out of our grid tiles here, our pattern UVs. So I'm going to output that as well. So now you can see we've got all the different patterns outputting from our rectangle SDF node here. And now I just need to set up sort priorities. So that one's going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And our node is all done. So you can see we're using that grid tiles node that we created a minute ago. And we're using that to create the UV coordinates that we then feed into our rectangle SDF node. And then that node is what's used to generate all of the different procedural grid patterns. So let's save this node and bring it into a shader and see what we can do with it. Okay, so here's a new shader that I created. I'm just going to open up my content drawer, come here to patterns, and I can grab my square tiles node and bring it in. Oh, and it looks like I forgot to name my output here, so let's jump back into there. And this last output, instead of stroke SDF underscore 1, this one is just going to be called UV. All right, so we'll save that, come back to our shader, and drag it in. And there we go. Now we have it correctly named. Okay, so we can output a base color as our fill. And you can see I've got a nice grid here. And I can control the number of tiles in the grid. Let's say I want 6 and 6. I can connect that up to my tiles input parameter. And I can control the size of the rectangles here. So let's add another value. Let's make these like 0.7 and 0.7. And this is going to make the borders in between the rectangles thicker because the rectangles are getting smaller. All right, and let's see what we can do with this blur input. So I'm going to add a value here. Obviously, if blur is 0, that's not going to work very well. But let's make it 0.1. And now you can see the edges of our tiles just got a little bit blurry. Let's see what our other outputs look like. So our stroke output looks like this. Instead of tiles, now I'm showing the outlines of the tiles. And we can also output the SDFs of the tiles. So you can see that our edges are blurry here. And here's the SDFs of the strokes. Boy, that's interesting. And then we also have the UV coordinates coming out here as well. So you can see this square tiles node, we're able to create all kinds of different patterns using this one node. It's really versatile. And next week, we're going to use this node to generate a really interesting pattern. So I hope you come back for that. And in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed the video and I hope you have a great week.